Hello guys, welcome to this new video. Today we are going to talk about label in Kubernetes. I know this is a hot topic. A lot of people have issue understanding how label works in Kubernetes. Today we walk you through, especially for the deployment file, to show you how label actually work in the deployment file. I will also talk about the location where the label are located, and I will also talk about the meaning of those labels at each location, because it doesn't mean the same thing. It is very important. I think this is one of the backbone of Kubernetes, understanding how the label system work, because that is how you can basically enable discovery and also connection in Kubernetes. So without further delay, let's go ahead and jump into the topic. But before we do that, if you are not subscribed yet into our channel, please go ahead and subscribe so that you don't have to miss any important video. You can also find us on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter as well, and on Facebook. So let's jump into the topic and talk about label in Kubernetes. Now, label in Kubernetes, right? And I mentioned earlier that we are going to focus more our energy on the deployment file, right? Now, mostly in Kubernetes, you'll be seeing label attached into service such as pod, node, and services. Those are mostly seen in stuff like pod, stuff like services, and stuff like node, plus other stuff, but mostly seen here. And what are they used for? Right? We need to understand, like, what is a label used for, right? And the label is just usually we use that to organize, right? It's using Kubernetes like to show Kubernetes, so so label are used to organize and select subset of object based on the characteristic, right? That's how we use to like organize and group sub stuff in Kubernetes. So in Kubernetes, what happened is that you will open a cluster and you can see 100 applications running. Now, how do we organize yourself? How do we identify each application, for example? How do we group each application as a human being, right? For example, to group each application as a human being, we are going to assign labels, and also we use label to tell to tell, for example, or object in those applications into how to discover. For example, how a deployment will be able to discover pod that are attached to him, or to it, or a stateful set will be able to discover pod that are attached to it, or a daemon set, right? How to make that service discovery, for example, happen, right? Like, just like, hey, how are we going to make that service discovery basically happen? And label is really important into that, because we use that to identify. Imagine, for example, you get into the crowd. You can single some people out if they wear, for example, the same T-shirt. You can single some people out, for example, if they wear the same hat. But if none of them is identified by, if a particular group is not identified by something specific, it will be difficult for you to identify. When you go into like a soccer game, you're able to say, oh, we have two teams playing, because you can see they're wearing different jersey, right? And only also the supporters, you can look at how the supporters, the outfit that supporters are wearing, and you can match that with the team team playing. For example, when Barcelona, for example, is playing, you will look at the supporter from Barcelona wearing the Barcelona T-shirt, and also supporter from Real Madrid wearing the white, which is the color of Real Madrid. So that's just how the label system actually work in Kubernetes. Now, we talk about, like, those label in Kubernetes, but in terms of Kubernetes, to be more specifically, I mentioned, right, they are used for grouping and selecting, right? So we use those label for grouping, like we mentioned here, like I mentioned earlier, we use that to group, and we can also use that for filtering, right, and query. We can use that to filter and query, right? We will be able to regroup. Let's say I have 50 applications with like maybe 200 pod running. How will a deployment be able to single out pod that it managed, right? It will use like a grouping system and the selecting system. You're going to use like a filtering and the query system to do that. Then we also use that as to identify, right? We put that under metadata, and we use that to identify, for example, which like when you type a deployment file, you want to know which port, like as a DevOps engineer, you will go to the cluster. For example, you type kubectl get port. If you want to find out, you will see multiple ports. You might see 100 port coming up. But if you want to find out which deployment control which port, for example, because you type kubectl get deploy, it will not show you port. It will just show you all the deployment. But for you to find out which deployment control which port, you will actually need to filter, for example, with the label, right? If a port carry a label, for example, environment prod, you can say kubectl get port -L environment equal prod. You'll be able to just single out all the port that actually carry that label. So it's very important to understand the concept of label. Now, in the deployment file, we have those labels located at 3 places, right? Those labels are located at 3 places in the deployment file. And in those 3 places, they mean different things. So we need to understand where are those labels located, and the location where they are, exactly what they mean. So I said earlier, they are at the 3 places. They are under the metadata. They are also under the spec. Then they are also under the template selector. So we go over. So 3 places, right? Under the metadata is actually the location, for example, where you can also mention about the names and the annotation. The spec is also a place where you have stuff like replica asset, right? And the template and everything is where you have container image and other. So we go deep into this. So now imagine that you have a deployment file like this. This is like a Kubernetes sample deployment file. Now, the first location of the label that I mentioned earlier is here. It's labeled under under the metadata, right? As you can see, there is a label, then it's a app web. So app, web, and label are like key pair value, right? And labels are in forms of key pair value. Pay attention to this. Labels are in form of key pair value. So we say app, web. So that's a key pair value, where app represent the key and web represent the value. Now, that's the location where we have label in the deployment file here. Now, what does it mean here? When we put the label under the metadata, what does that label mean actually when we put it under the metadata? Now, when we put it here, we are going to say, well, we put this here like a direct attachment, for example, and this is just like the name that we're going to give to the resource, right? They're just like the name that we're going to give to the resource just to organize, meaning that the label that we put here under deployment is actually like a nickname. It's actually like a nickname that we are attaching to this deployment, right? That's what it means when you have the label at this location here under metadata, right? Like I said here, these labels are attached directly to the deployment resource itself, and they are used to organize, find, and manage Kubernetes objects. Now, what does it mean, right? What does it mean? Meaning that this is a nickname that I gave to my deployment file. It's true that the name of my deployment file, as you can see here, is called my web app, but this is just, I can add a nickname there using the label. Then I'll be able to use that nickname, like, to organize, for example, to filter, and also like to query, right? As a DevOps engineer, when I go type kubectl, if I'm doing some troubleshooting, that comes to be very handy. Now, the second element, for example, categorize, right? We use that to categorize also, right? We can use that to categorize. But at the end of the day, like I said, it's just a nickname, a label that you place, but that's on the deployment file itself. So it's a label that I'm placing on the deployment itself, so that when I call that deployment, it will be used. So that's a label for the deployment. The label under there, under metadata, that's a label that we assign to the deployment for example. Now, right? And they don't have direct impact on the operation. They don't have direct impact on the operation of the pod, meaning that if you don't put those, it's not going to hurt your application. For example, I mean, if you don't put it, your pod will still be able to come up, right? If you don't put that, your pod will still be able to come. It doesn't hurt, but technically, by best practice, it's always good to identify stuff, because in your Kubernetes cluster, especially in production, you're going to have a lot, 100, 200 of deployment. How do you filter deployment, right? And sometimes deployment file, deployment carry like the same name. So how are you going to filter deployment? Let's say, for example, when I go to a Kubernetes cluster where I have a lot of deployment, now, if I want to filter only deployment that carry this label, right? Let's imagine that I have an application called Canary. Canary is a microservice, and that microservice has 15 services, right? And every single service is actually a pod. And to get a pod on, you might need something, either, let's say, deployment. So that application called Canary is going to have 15 deployment. For example, it's going to have 15 deployment. Therefore, it's going to have 15 deployment file, right? It's going to have 15 deployment file. Now, when I go to my cluster, how do I actually filter all deployment belonging to my Canary application? That's the question. Like, when I go to the cluster, how do I filter all deployment, for example, of my application Canary? What I'm going to do, I'm going to basically assign a label. Let's say app equal web. I will assign a label under metadata to that, to all the deployment file, to all the 15 deployment file. I will assign the label to all the 15 deployment file. Now, when I type kubectl get, for example, I said port here, but you can also say get label, say kubectl get deploy -L, L stands for label, app equal web. Kubernetes will only return all deployment having that label, right? Kubernetes will only return all deployment having that label, right? -L stands for label, right? If I say, for example, kubectl, I said here get pod, but you can also say kubectl get deployment or get deploy -L app equal web. It will go ahead and single out all deployment having that label, meaning the label that goes under the metadata are actually the label that we use a lot, like we as a human being, we use to filter stuff. So that's a label that we place there. That's a name that we as a human being we place there to be able to filter, so that when we go to the cluster and we start typing, we can filter those out of the big crowd easily, right? And this cannot hurt the application. If you put it there or you don't put it there, it's not going to hurt it. But technically, when thing gets crazy in the cluster, meaning that you have a cluster that is running multiple applications, it's always good to go ahead and place those labels so that it will be easy for you to use it as a reference. So that's the meaning of the label under the metadata. Now, another location that we talk about is actually the one under the spec, right? Yeah, that's the one under the spec. So also notice that we have that call under the spec. Now, it's true that under the spec, I want you to pay attention. Under the metadata, as you can see here, we say label, then we pass the label. But under the spec, we say selector, match label, web, right? We say selector, match label, web. Now, what is the meaning, for example, what is the meaning, for example, of match label, right? The match label so basically tell Kubernetes that, hey, manage, like on this deployment, the match label will tell Kubernetes that, hey, all resources that carry this label app web are resources that you actually manage. Like, go out there, look for resources. Every resources that match this label app colon web, the key pair, these are actually the resources that you are managing. That's the meaning of match label, right? That's the meaning of match label. So this is just for like discovery. Now, here, that's what we use for discovery, right? So it which just that field just tell Kubernetes, just check the deployment file which file, like, which port fall under his purview, right? It tells the deployment file which port fell under his purview, meaning that it just tells the deployment file which port it is managing, right? It tells the deployment file which port you are managing, meaning that you are managing port carrying the label app colon web. So every port that carry the label app colon web are actually the port that you are managing. So the label that we place under the match label under the selector, so spec selector match label, the label that goes there are actually the label that is used for discovery. So Kubernetes will go out there and look for this deployment file, will look for port that carry this label, and those will be port that it managed. So that's basically to tell him the port that it managed. Like I said here, this label are used in specs section of deployment to define how the deployment find which port to manage, right? To tell him which port to manage. So it tell him that, hey, any port that you see with these are actually the port that you manage, compared to the one that is under the metadata, because the one that is under the metadata are just the one that we place there as a human being. So as a human being, we need a label under the metadata because we use that to filter. It's just when we are typing kubectl get deployment, we will see like 200 deployment coming up. But if I type kubectl get deployment -l app equal web, it will only show me deployment with carrying the label app equal web, right? We say here, we put here in terms of key value pair, but when we are typing the command we type, we put that in terms of key pair, right? So that's just for us human being, but this is actually for Kubernetes itself. This is for Kubernetes. This is actually telling Kubernetes that, hey, every single pod out there that carry this label actually can be managed by this, is being managed by this deployment file. So when you type kubectl, if you type, for example, kubectl, delete pod, right? Or maybe, for example, if you type kubectl, delete, if you delete this deployment file, Kubernetes will go ahead and look for all the pods carrying this label and will delete all those pods, right? That's what it means, right? That's the only port that have label matching the selector will be managed by the deployment. So this deployment only will manage port that carry that label, right? This deployment will only manage port that carry that label. If you delete this deployment, it will go ahead and delete all the port carrying that label, right? If you delete this deployment, it will go ahead and delete all the port carrying that label. Now, if you go ahead, for example, and scale this deployment, it will go ahead and scale all the port carrying that label. For example, if you modify something into the deployment file, it will go ahead and modify on all the port carrying that label, right? Now, that's very important, right? I mentioned here like this is crucial for deployment to know which port to update, delete, right? That's how it knows. It is on this section that you tell him, when you type kubectl delete, right? You tell him exactly which port to update, delete, replace, to roll, or to scale, right? Use label under that portion. Now, you have another part. So I just want to emphasize here. The label that goes under metadata are actually the label that are really important for us as a human being. When we have multiple deployment file in our cluster, if we type kubectl get deploy, we can filter this deployment. But the label that is under the spec selector match label, that's actually the label that Kubernetes itself. That's a label that Kubernetes will use to filter, right? That's a label that Kubernetes itself used to go ahead and actually filter stuff. Like, know that, hey, every single port that carry this label is actually managed by this file, right? That's how this deployment will recognize, for example, every single port that is managing out there. So that's really important to know. So another location that we see a label is actually under the template, right? Another deployment where we see is under the template. So under the template, you also have the label, and the template also has metadata, right? We say template metadata, then it followed by the label. Now, what are these labels? What are these labels here that are under the template? It's simple. The label that you see that goes under the template are basically the label that will be created, right? Those are the labels that will be created in the pod, right? So when we will be creating the pod, those labels will be placed there. And remember, we say template because why? Kubernetes will actually use this template to create the pod. That is why you see all the specific, all most of the like functional specification is under template, like containers, like image pull secret, like container pod, stuff like that goes under template. So now, so the label under template, the label under metadata, right? In template we have metadata and then label. That label is just the label that will be created. So when we create the pod, all the pod will come with this label here, right? When we create the pod, all the pod will come with that label here. Now, one thing really important that you need to know is that the label under the template should match the label under the spec, right? The label under the template should match the label under the spec. Of course, it makes sense. I just explained earlier something simple. I said the label under the spec, the label under spec selector match label are actually the label that Kubernetes used to discover pod out there. Now, and then I mentioned that the label under template metadata are actually the label that will be assigned to the pod when it get created. That's a label that will be given to the pod when it get created. Of course, both need to match because when this block here is there to make sure that it find out pod that have been created, and those pods need to carry this label. So these two labels should always be the same. It doesn't matter the number of label that you put. If you put like 5 label under selector, you need to put 5 label under the metadata. So these two labels need to match, but the one on top here, they don't need to match because this is for us human beings, but these two are used by Kubernetes, right? These two are used by Kubernetes. So pay attention to that. And we put that, for example, usually at work, you are going to see, we can define, like, let's say, if a pod is made for a specific environment, we can say, for example, environment colon dev, environment colon prod, environment colon production or pre-production, sandbox staging. So it depends. So that's just like a quick rundown, right? Quick rundown on like different thing that we have in Kubernetes. So just to just to make sure that you guys get this right. So the first label here, the label under metadata are actually the label that is very useful for us as human beings because that's a label that we can use to filter deployment. It is just for deployment, right? The label that we assign to filter deployment. And then the label under the selector is actually the label that is used for discovery, right? The label under selector is actually the label that is used for discovery. And then the label under template are the label that will be created on the pod. So you put it here so that at pod creation, this label will be created there, right? At pod creation, this label will be created there. And when I say selector, the selector will read the label from the template, right? The selector will read the label from the template, for example. So that's really important. That's really important, for example, to know. Now, in summary, right? In summary, match label on the deployment are for categorizing deployment resources itself. So that's the label under metadata. That's what it means, right? The metadata label, right, on the deployment are for categorizing deployment resources itself. Remember what I said? Deployment resources itself, right? Very important for human beings. Now, the selector label, right? Now, the selector label in the spec section are for deployment to identify which pod it should manage, right? The label under selector match label. So this is just to make sure that to identify which pod it should manage. So that tells the deployment file which pod it need to manage. Now, the label under template label in the in the template metadata section apply to the pod created by the deployment and must match the selector label for the deployment, right? So the label under metadata, the label under spec, right? The label under spec should match the label under the template, right? Very important. Don't forget that. It's not going to work. If you want, you can give it a try. Kubernetes will throw you an error. I hope you actually get something out of this short video on how to manage label. I'm going to launch a Kubernetes video on Kubernetes where I will actually show you how to write a deployment file. Then I will come back again into how to manage this label. It was a pleasure having you around. If you like if you find something interesting on the video, go ahead and like it. If you have not subscribed yet, please go ahead and subscribe. You can also see us on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram. Thank you very much.